Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I am here today with my friend Cathy Loerzel. Cathy, it's good to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
You've been here before, and you've even been here before to talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is the whole subject of how do we engage not our own story, but another person's story. It's one thing to address, explore, be curious about your own story, and I talk a lot about that on this podcast. But it's quite another to engage a friend's story, or your partner's story, or a coworker's story. So let's just begin with the big picture. Why is it important to help someone else that you care about get clear about their family of origin story? What's the point of helping them with that?
In this day and age, I've noticed more and more people, like their lives are kind of falling off the rails. So many of my friends, family, people are really struggling. And I don't think that's new necessarily. But for me, my group of friends who are in our 40s, it's hard. And so I think why I care about this work and how to engage someone else's story isn't just for therapists or pastors or people who are working with people, but all of us need to learn how to be better friends and more relational humans so that we can help each other when we're in need. And that's everybody. That's not just your therapist. Right now, the therapists I know have full practices and it's almost impossible to get in to see someone. And it's insanely expensive to try to get care, with people who are fairly good at it, which tells me that we need more people who know how to care about one another regardless of their profession. That part of our calling is learning how to tend to people. And the way we tend to one another is through engaging and knowing how to talk about our lives together. And not just a sense of, hey, how are you? I'm okay. I'm sorry about your mom sort of conversation. But how do we actually tend to one another's hearts in a way that allows us to have comfort and freedom and connection? And that's hard to do. And I think for a lot of us, we're so isolated, we didn't necessarily learn from our parents how to have good connections. And so we're needing to learn that as adults.
When it comes to engaging someone's story, when it comes to doing that well, it's important to understand some of the basic theory behind story work. We could call this Story Theory 101. Will you share some of what do we mean by the basic theory behind story work, or Story Theory 101? What are some of the bullet points that are under that heading that people need to have a good grasp of?
I think the basis of story work is that we don't always know how to understand our own story. And so we need another witness to come in and see it for us. So I travel a lot for work. And when I'm gone, I'm at someone else's house or a hotel or whatever. And I come into my house after being gone for 4 or 5 days, and I smell all the smells of my house. For 10 minutes, all of a sudden I walk in, I'm like, what's that smell? Ooh, is that what's happening over in the bathroom, or what's happening in the garbage? For about 10 minutes, I can smell the truth of my home that I live in every day. Because when I'm living there, I become nose blind. My point in that is that we become nose blind to our own stories in the same way that we become nose blind to our homes. And so where I have a window where I'm removed enough and I can smell all of the smells, when someone else comes into my home, they can smell those smells right away because they're not nose blind to them. And so what we're doing with story work is really going back into people's homes, their childhood homes, seeing scenes, understanding the complexities, the relationship, what happened to them. And because it's not our story, we're not nose blind in the way that the person is. When I look at someone else's story, I'm wanting to put myself into their narrative and then be able to go, this smells kind of rotten. This smells off to me. There's something weird about this. Have you noticed that before?
Yeah.
And for most of us, it's not until someone else points that out to us that we actually can connect to something that we know intuitively is true, but we've become too nose blind to really understand it. So the gift of story work is helping people by going back in and offering a second opinion or even a first opinion in terms of, someone else who's able to see. Can we help people understand parts of their story that may actually be creating a lot of damage or have created a lot of damage, that when we go back in, we can point out some of the things that feel off to us. And oftentimes when you point that out, people are willing to go there because they know somewhere in their body that that's true. But it's not until they have a secondary person or a person outside of their story telling them that they're willing to really start to engage.
I want to dispose of a myth kind of here at the beginning that happens, that a lot of people I think subscribe to, even if it's unconsciously. And the myth is that you have to be this super duper gifted counselor therapist type with magical powers to really know how to engage someone's story. In other words, that there are only a few people that are really gifted enough or skilled enough or trained enough to do this well. And I want to say that is a myth. Engaging another person's story is part art and part science. It can be learned, though. It can be learned. It's not a magical ability that some people have and some people don't have. There are principles that apply, but principles that can be learned. And that's the science part. And then there are skills that I think need to be kind of caught by watching other people do it. And I consider that the art part. But the idea that I could never be good at this because I don't have an LPC, or I didn't go to the Seattle school, or I didn't get trained as a social worker, whatever your objection is, like I want to dispel of that myth. This task of engaging someone's story well, witnessing it, can be learned. And you and I are pretty passionate about teaching people how to do this, which is why we are co-teaching another virtual conference on how to engage another person's story. It's coming up. It'll be held Saturday, May 13th from 8 to 4 Pacific time. And if, after listening to this episode, you want to learn more about, okay, how do I, practically speaking, how do I engage another person's story well, then you can sign up for this virtual conference. You can do it at my website, adamyoungcounseling.com. It will be May 13th. Let's just transition to talking some about, like, what are we going to engage and address at this conference? You're going to begin, Cathy, by teaching Story Theory 101. And then I'm going to outline what I call the 7 principles of effective story engagement. Let me just say what they are right now. I'm not going to go through them all now, but let me just say what they are so that you know what's coming up. The first principle is that attuning to the storyteller is more important than engaging their story brilliantly. Oh my gosh, so important. Number 2, principle 2, related. Kindness will take you further than skill and gifting. Character always wins out in this stuff. All right, number 3, use the exquisite instrument that is your body. And if that doesn't mean anything to you right now, come to the conference. I'm going to explain all these in much more detail. Number 4, you have to always be monitoring the storyteller's affect. I talk a lot about affect on this podcast. Affect refers to your moment-by-moment internal bodily sensations. And it ranges from numb and shut down, which is, I call that like 0 on a 0 to 10 scale, all the way up to panic, rage, terror. That would be like a 10. You need to be monitoring where is the storyteller in terms of their physiology as they're engaging their story. 5th principle, your right brain matters way more than your left brain when you're engaging someone's story. And I'm gonna actually explain this one in a minute. Number 6, there's always a reason for human behavior. Whenever there are characters in someone's story, like a mom, a dad, a sibling, a stepfather, these are human beings with intentionality. God created human beings to be creatures of intent, purpose, will, design. And And anytime someone's in a story, they're acting with agency and with intentionality. It's very important to keep that in mind when you're smelling around in the rooms of someone's house. And then number 4 is that repairing rupture is more important than engaging their story perfectly, which is a very freeing principle for those of us that are story engagers, because it means you don't have to do it perfectly. You do not have to do it perfectly. Okay, so that's a brief overview of the 7 principles. For right now, what I want to do, though, is just explain, maybe go through the last 3, just the last 3. The last 3 is, the first one is, your right brain matters much more than your left brain. So when I say that, before I explain what I mean, Cathy, because you haven't talked in a little bit, what comes up for you when I say that your right brain matters more than your left brain when you're engaging someone's story?
Well, why don't you define what the right and left brain do?
Yeah, okay, so great point. You have 2 brains. You do. You have a right hemisphere, you have a left hemisphere. They do very different things. Now, for our purposes today, let's just say that the words that you speak to the storyteller come from your left brain. Left brain, words that you speak. Your tone of voice and your facial expression come from your right brain. So, to say it a little bit differently, verbal communication comes from your left brain. Nonverbal communication comes from your right brain. Here's what's crucial to understand. Here's the point of this principle. The storyteller is way more interested in your right brain, i.e. your nonverbal communication, than your left brain. The storyteller is paying far more attention to what you are communicating with your face, your facial expression, and your tone of voice than whatever words you're speaking to them. Now, the question is why? Why? Why is the storyteller paying more attention to your nonverbal communication? Why are they so tuned into your facial expression and your tone of voice? And the reason is nonverbal communication, we all know this, is involuntary and unedited. So let's make this really practical. Suppose the storyteller has just told you about something that she did sexually that she feels immense shame about. Okay, she has shared that in the story. Now, her right brain is going to read your face to determine what you actually think about that sexual thing that she did. Now, you can say something with your words like, hey, look, I don't think you're a horrible person for doing that. But inside of you, if you really do judge her, if you really do think she's a bad person for doing that thing, it is going to come across in your nonverbal communication. And her right hemisphere is going to pick up on that. Why? Because unlike verbal communication, unlike words, nonverbal communication is involuntary and unedited. So I have a little bit more, but what's coming up for you?
Well, I was just thinking, a lot of this, David Schnarch calls this mind mapping, right? Our capacity to map out verbal and nonverbal communication and understand intent and kind of what's going on for someone. And this is a survival mechanism. This is the way that we figure out if we're safe or if we're not safe or if we're around someone who's trustworthy, right? And so what we've come to understand is that really we have 2 different things that are going on in our bodies all the time. One is what someone's telling us, and then the other thing is what we're picking up intuitively through our right brain, through our limbic resonance, a capacity to kind of understand what's going on underneath the surface. And so it can be very confusing for people when we're saying one thing, but our body is telling them another. And this is what happens as kids, right? So as kids, I always tell this story about my son, Aiden. He'll come to me and want to play Legos. And I'll be like, buddy, I would love to play Legos, but I can't because I have to do all this other work. And I have to do laundry and dishes and blah, 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 right? So I'm telling him I would love to play, but I can't. My body and the part of him that can read me is telling him I don't want to play with him.
Right.
Right. So a kid will be at a story war right away because what are they going to believe? What mama is telling them or what their body knows to be true about what's going on underneath the surface. So when we're engaging someone else's story, we have to understand that that dance is happening between us. And so it asks us to have a lot of integrity and also have done a lot of work around our own stories, because, if someone tells you like the story that you just said, Adam, and you feel uncomfortable about what they've done sexually, if you haven't worked through that in your own body around your own arousal, and you're telling them, oh, you don't need to feel shame about that, they already are, because you actually feel shame in your own body. And this is the beauty of the fact that we reveal ourselves even when we don't. And it also is terrifying, because it means we think we're getting away with a lot more than we really are. Because we can read. We read each other all the time, but then we're overriding what we're understanding intuitively, because we don't want to believe what their bodies are telling us. We want to believe what they're saying, which is, it's the same. Like if you go to a park and you see someone you haven't seen in a while, and they're like, oh, hey, it's so good to see you. And that's not what they are. They are not happy to see you. And that, and your whole body starts to shut down, because and you want to get out of there as fast as you can. And so I think what we're talking about is that dance between the right and the left brain, where we have to understand that what we're actually feeling and our intuition and our subconscious parts of us have a lot more to do with how well we do this work than what we're able to say in a moment.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a great summary of Principle 5. Your right brain matters way more to the storyteller than the words coming out of your mouth, which are mediated mostly by your left hemisphere. Okay, that's that one. Next principle. Remember, there's always a reason for human behavior. Okay, what do I mean by this? I started going off on this earlier, but let me just flesh it out some more. Suppose the storyteller believes that his story with his dad is a story of neglect. His take is, my dad just didn't do emotions. He wasn't there for me. He was preoccupied with his work. My dad neglected me. Okay, that's his understanding of his autobiographical narrative. In my experience, neglect is rarely a sufficient explanation for what's going on. In other words, there's almost always a reason for neglect. There's something driving the neglect. So if your dad never paid attention to you, the question is, why? Did dad pay attention to your older sister or your older brother? If he did, okay, then why didn't he pay attention to you? Your task as a story engager is to make an incoherent narrative more coherent. That's what we're doing. When we bear witness to a story, when we smell what doesn't smell right inside the house of their family of origin, we are attempting to help them get clearer about what was actually true, to make an incoherent narrative more coherent. Now, the storyteller might say, I just don't know. I don't know why my mother was so mean to me. We'll switch it to mom. I don't know why my mom was so mean to me. Well, principle 6 of engaging stories is that there's always a reason. And it's never, mom was just a mean person. Okay, now how do I know that? Because the storyteller will have memories of mom being kind to certain people in her life. So the question is, okay, if mom has the capacity for kindness, why was she so consistently cruel toward you? As you're listening, what's happening?
I'm thinking of lots and lots of stories. And this is the part that, this is going to sound weird, but this is the fun part of working with people's stories, is in some ways you get to be like a detective and an FBI profiler all at the same time. People's stories don't make sense to them until you start to understand what's going on underneath. And so you're saying, there's a reason, but a lot of our freedom comes from being able to put the pieces together, because oftentimes children will take on the reason as, I wasn't good enough.
Right.
Or I just wasn't worth, they'll take it on themselves instead of understanding the more deep complexity of what was going on within the family system to create these relational dynamics. When we work with stories, we're always looking to map out. When I meet with a new client and we're doing story work together, I spend the whole first session just asking them to tell me, what do you know about your family? Just tell me what you know. What do you know about your dad? What do you know about your mom? What do and I'm sitting there and I'm creating a picture of the dynamics that were going on in their family, and I'm listening to how they're talking about what their face does when they light up. Do they light up more around talking about mom or talking about dad? What happens when they start talking about their siblings or the trajectory of their home? You learn so much just by how someone talks about their family without even getting into story necessarily, because you're actually starting to build a profile for each person and starting to see how they interact. And it's revelatory. When you start to pull back the layers, you see things as both the person working with the story and the storyteller, and you start to see themes, and you start to have aha moments around, oh, that's why I felt so small. That's why I felt so wounded. That's why I stayed alone all the time in my room, because mom was always with my brother and was connected with him in a way she wasn't connected to me, and I was really left on my own, right? You start to see things really quickly once you start to peel back some of those layers and understand what's going on underneath the surface.
Okay, so that's principle 6. There's always a reason why people in the story are doing what they're doing. Principle 7, and then we'll move on to a different section. Repairing rupture is much more important than engaging their story perfectly. Look, there is no way to do this perfectly. That's an absurd category. There will be times when you miss the storyteller, when you're not attuned either to what they're saying or what the expression on their face, the tone in their voice. So for example, suppose you just said something provocative to the storyteller, and as they are pondering your words, their face changes, because they're thinking about difficulties in their present day marriage. For whatever reason, what you said, that's where they went internally. And you completely miss that the storyteller has departed from the story and that they're preoccupied with the hardship in their marriage. Okay, this kind of misattunement, it happens all the time. And it's not a big deal as long as it is repaired. Now, what does it mean to repair? To repair is to acknowledge, like in vivo, that you miss them in some way, that you're no longer tracking with them, that the two of you are no longer joined and connected. So the first step of repair is simply acknowledging that and saying, like, where are you? Well, I'm thinking about this stuff in my marriage. Oh, how long have you been doing that? Well, at least 45 seconds. Okay, I had no idea. That is a moment of repair. The more quickly you repair, the better, which means that you want to frequently check in with the storyteller to find out like what's happening for them internally. And this can be challenging, especially when you're kind of new at this work and you're so focused on like the story part and being a good story engager, and you're so focused on the story that you can miss the person's face who's sitting right in front of you. That's happened to me so many times. The question is, when you've lost someone's face, will you go back? Will you go back? Because you're free to go back. Story engagement isn't about being right. It's about being attuned enough to the person's face to know like when you've lost them, and then, hey, okay, I need to go back. One of the things I think that keeps us, frankly, from being better at this work is cowardice. We are afraid of saying the wrong thing, whatever that means, or saying something hurtful. Here's a secret to engaging trauma narratives. You are allowed to screw this up. You are allowed to miss a tune. You're allowed to do harm. There's no way to step into waters as fraught as trauma narratives are and not do harm in the process. The issue is, will you repair? When you miss a tune, when you say something and it is completely not where the storyteller is, and you're taking them somewhere tangential that is not going to be helpful to them, will you just acknowledge that and then say, okay, can we go back to where you felt connected to the girl in the story? Thoughts, Cathy? Well, here, let me ask this. Can you share an example of have you ever done this? Misattuned to a storyteller or done harm and needed to repair it?
All the time. Look, so this is what I was thinking as you're talking, is that how comfortable we feel around repairing is very storied based off of our own story. So if you have not had much experience with someone else repairing with you, or the idea that you've been able to repair and the relationship has continued, it's going to feel very difficult. You're going to freak out whenever you mess up, because in the back of your mind, you're thinking, oh, well, this is it. It's over. There's no, we don't, as soon as there's rupture, it's death. As soon as there's rupture, there's loss, there's breaking of relationship, and we can never go back. And so what I would want all of us to think about as we're even considering doing rupture and repair while we're working in stories is how well has that gone for you in your past, so that you can really contend with your own heart, so that you can be more free to move into places where you're repairing. Right? Because if you don't believe that it works or it can work, you're going to deny when you create rupture. You're going to defend. You're going to leave yourself. If your experience with your parents is that as soon as you brought something to them that didn't go, they left. They broke relationship, or they turned their face from you, right? And so as you consider doing this with someone else, you have to start with you, or else you're not going to be able to have the courage to lean into rupture and repair and to practice. So I would say, even before you start doing this with other people, how well do you repair rupture with your spouse, with your kids, with your friends? Are you able to keep a short account for where you can say, gosh, you know what, I think I really messed up here and I'm really sorry. And I know that I kind of breached our confidence, or, and are you willing to and able to step into those places without feeling like your whole world is going to fall apart? Because if you can do that, then when you're in a trauma story, you're going to be able to settle your body and then be able to say, hey, there's hope here. This isn't the end. This doesn't mean that if I mess up, then I no longer get to engage people's stories. Like, we get to kind of take down the level of fear around rupture, failing someone, because we start to practice that there is something beyond the failure. So like I was just running a story group last weekend and had a rupture within the group. It was I won't go into detail, but it was significant, and I hurt someone's feelings, really. And it was kind of, I don't know that I would go back and do it differently, but I kind of like redirected because I wanted to go somewhere else with someone's story, and it hurt their feelings, and I could have left it there and just kind of said, they're going to have to deal, or they could have left it, but we decided to go back. And it was sweet, because it was like, look, I'm not going to leave us here. I'm not going to leave us with this rupture. I'm not going to leave us, with you having to question whether or not I care about you, or if I believe in you, or, if it's even possible for us to reconcile. Like, I want there to be more to this moment for both of us. And it ended up being more significant than anything else that had happened in the group, because it was a moment that showed each of us that, like, I actually had hurt her feelings, and I could still go back and own that. And that was incredibly important for all of us to be able to see, and important for me to be able to know that I can do that as well. I didn't lose myself. I didn't go into a shame spiral, because those are all things that, this is why we avoid rupture and repair in general, is because we're terrified of what it looks like. And it can be really scary. How do you do with rupture and repair?
Well, I really like what you said about, like, I need to be able to be comfortable in my own body with my failures and with the harm that I do. If I miss a tune, or I say something that hurts the storyteller's feelings, and they express that either verbally or non-verbally, and that sends me into a place of like immense shame, and I suck at this, and how could I have said that to her? And I shouldn't have used that tone of, like, I knew this. I know this about me. I know I do this. I'm too provocative. I come in guns blazing, right? Whatever it is, if I can't kind of hold on to my own goodness in that moment, then shame will not just take me out, but it will prevent any meaningful repair from happening, which is I guarantee you, is reenactment for the storyteller.
Yeah.
And that's awful. And so it is really important to have done enough work yourself that you know when you get tempted to believe that your heart is not good, i.e. to feel shame.
Yeah.
So that's principle 7. And we're going to talk about all these principles in more depth at the conference. But now I just want to shift and talk about some of the tactics. The word tactic means an action that is carefully planned to achieve a specific end. Now, the specific end in my mind of story engagement, the goal, is increased freedom for the storyteller to become who he or she truly is, to take up residence in the fullness of their soul. You want the storyteller to be able to breathe a little better after the engagement than before. You want some movement, or at least imagination, for freedom from places of bondage and places of stuckness. That's why a storyteller is bringing a story. There is bondage and there's stuckness. So I want to give you a preview of some of the story engagement tactics that we'll explain in detail on Saturday, May 13th. We're not going to go through all of them, but I've picked a couple. Here's one tactic, and I'm actually going to ask you to explain it, Cathy. You have to explore the trauma before the trauma, okay? There is the trauma. Let's say, for example, 13-year-old girl sexually abused by her grandfather over summer break. Okay, that is the trauma. However, there is always a trauma before the trauma. What do we mean by that, Cathy?
So the way I talk about it is that abuse never happens in a vacuum. There is always a setup for how someone gets abused and why.
What do you mean by a setup? Well, talk about this 13-year-old girl with her stepfather or grandfather, whatever.
So let's say this girl is being abused by her grandfather. She has a mother and a father who should be able to read this young girl and understand what's going on with her body, with what's going on with her mind, her affect, and so she comes home after these weekends and her parents see signs,
right,
of what's happening. So that's the aftermath, right? It's where you have parents who are not seeing the signs that they should be seeing. Now here's where it gets even darker. Oftentimes, so like a grandfather, the granddaughter is hardly ever the first person he abused. So here's the even darker part of the story, is that for a lot of people who have that story, their mother, the grandfather's daughter, is the first one who was abused. And now the mother is allowing her father to have access to her daughter, even though she knows he's a pedophile.
Even if it wasn't that dark, let's just say mom wasn't abused. The trauma before the trauma is whatever hunger is created in this 13-year-old through the absence of care from mom and dad that makes her very susceptible to grandfather's grooming, kindness, comfort, care, attention, affection, etc. You got to remember, 13-year-olds, we long for delight. Hey, I'm 50. I long for delight. But especially when I was 13, right? This 13-year-old is made for attention, connection, affirmation, all of that. If she's not getting any of that at home, she is extremely susceptible to whoever comes along and offers that.
And I think that's the part where often people's when people come and talk about their abuse stories, oftentimes it's not actually the abuse that is the most difficult thing or where they're most bound. It's the fact that they didn't say no, or they kept wanting to go back. And so again, for this 13-year-old, right? If you're working with her as a 45-year-old woman, she's more concerned with the fact that like she knew something was going on in her body with her grandfather, and she still wanted to go back because there was more life at that home than there was at her parents' house because of the deadness that was going on. And so again, like wherever there's longing, that's the setup.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so that's one tactic we're going to flesh out. Here's another one. You want to invite the storyteller to be embodied as they are engaging with you. In other words, you want to invite the storyteller to get connected to the physical sensations in their body, like the stuff they're feeling from their neck down. So let's just talk about the body for a minute, shall we? The body speaks. All right, your body speaks. It has spoken in the past and it is speaking now. The primary way that your body speaks is through sensations. Sensation is the voice of your body. Your body communicates with you via shifts in sensation. So, question, do you listen to this communication that is always coming from your body? Do you listen to the voice of your body? Because as you are engaging someone's story, you want to regularly invite them to check in with what their body is experiencing. Now, what do I mean by sensations? Well, a tightness in the jaw. So let's take this 13-year-old girl, right? Let's say she's 43. She's in your office and you're engaging her story of sexual abuse as a 13-year-old. What do you feel in your body as we talk about the walks you would take in the park with your grandfather? And she might need multiple choice, right? Like clenched teeth, a racing heart, trembling in your chest, a knot in your back, butterflies in your stomach, a lump in your throat. I don't know. But what happens when you scan your body and just notice? Just notice. Because the sensations in your body tell the truth about your present experience. Your body is a truth teller. You may not know what truth it's telling, but your body doesn't lie. It can't. So suppose a woman, a different example. Suppose a woman has just shared a story in which her mother humiliated her. That's the story. It's not sexual abuse. Mom has humiliated her. It can be very helpful to ask the storyteller, as you think back on your mom saying that humiliating thing to you, what do you feel in your body right now? And you might have to get more specific. What sensations are you feeling in your stomach? Do you feel anything in your chest? Do you notice anything in your throat? And suppose she responds with, yeah, I feel like this tight, like heavy feeling in my chest. All right, in my opinion, your next sentence to them needs to be just 2 words long. Notice that. Notice that. Those can be 2 of the most powerful words you say in the whole story engagement. In fact, Bessel van der Kolk, who's a prominent trauma therapist, he says that the 2 words he speaks most often in therapy are those 2 words. Notice that. Why are those 2 words so important? Because you're inviting the storyteller to actually be in their body, to be with their physical sensations. And just let 30 seconds pass as they feel that tightness in their chest, as they notice it. And then what I always ask, and it bears so much fruit, is I say, if that tightness in your chest could talk, what might it say? What am I doing? I'm inviting the storyteller to let their body speak. Because stories, they are written more in the cells of our bodies than in our cortex. They are written more in the tissues that compose our stomach, our chest, our heart, our throat. Your body knows things. We could put it this way. Your body knows things that your brain does not. Mm-hmm. So you want the storyteller to be connected to her body. Yeah. So Cathy, personal experience with any of this?
You know, with a lot of people who suffer from traumatic childhood experiences and difficult things as a kid, we learn how to ignore our bodies and to override them. This has been a huge piece of my personal work over the last couple of years, especially because I spent so much time overriding the sensations that were going on in my body and really ignoring them in order to produce or get out of myself what I needed, and had very little tolerance for what my body was actually feeling, which ended up being the roadmap to deeper healing. Even as trauma therapists, right? We have our own journey to go on because our bodies are kind of locked up. Because they're too dangerous. Because here's the deal, is that if you start to listen to what your body is telling you, you have to shift how you're engaging. Because your body is going to tell you when you're overloaded, when you're uncomfortable, when you're in the presence of someone who is making you feel uncomfortable, even though you need to keep engaging with them, right? So a lot of times our bodies are telling us things that we don't want to hear. So we override. And what Adam is saying, and I agree with, is that part of our work is to say no. Like, we actually have to listen and then respond and figure out what the body is telling us that we're so terrified of knowing. Because our body will tell us when we're disgusted, when we're aroused, when we're afraid, when we're anxious, and so many of us are like, I can't feel that because it's too dangerous and I don't like the sensation. And so we dissociate, we watch Netflix, we drink alcohol, we overwork, we overload our schedules so we don't have to feel any of it. And all of a sudden we wonder like why we're so disconnected from our bodies in our day-to-day life. But I think what we're inviting people to through this work is reintegration. And it's not enough to just have a mind, like we need to be able to be engaged with our bodies to have more joy and more pleasure and more connection, more freedom, more delight. And if our bodies are locked up because of our trauma, then we're not going to be able to actually experience the fullness that we're actually meant for.
Okay, let's end today by just talking about the second half of the conference, which is the part that we're calling clinic. What are we going to do during the clinic part of this conference on May 13th, and why?
I think you said this earlier in the top of the podcast, but there's a science to this and there's an art. And I think the art is really learned intuitively through engaging stories, and then learning when you engage a story, where do you feel it in your body? Where does it take your brain and your mind? And so we'll practice. There's nothing that teaches you how to do this faster than seeing it done. Because it's almost like osmosis, where you sit in it and it seeps into your system, and then you start to go, oh, I mean, that's why I love doing groups, because you sit there with 6 people and you work one story, but everyone is sitting there engaging and they're learning something about themselves, about where they would go, about what they miss, about what they don't want to see because of their story. It's revelatory every single time you see or hear someone engage a story. And so we're going to look at 3 different levels. One is just we're actually going to look at a fairy tale. We're going to look at Hansel and Gretel, and something kind of benign, a children's fairy tale that when you actually start to look at it from the perspective of story work and family of origin, you start to see things that you're like, I had no idea. It's popping open to it. We're exegeting it, and you start to see these themes play out. That are universal and have been around forever. And then we're going to look at some movie clips to get you back into your body and to start seeing like how you actually feel stories in your body viscerally, and what does that tell you, and how can you start to listen to that and develop that part of yourself. And then we're going to do a live engagement with an amazing person who's volunteered to do some work with us, which is amazing. And that's really helpful as well. And so I think we're going to be trying to kind of grab different layers and levels of how we learn and how we engage to start to really move through holistically, so that, depending on how you learn and how you take in information, there will be ways for you to engage.
Yeah, our mutual friend Bethany has volunteered to read one of her stories at the conference, and then you and I will just take turns engaging her about the story, and we'll do that for an hour. And the point of that is for you participants to catch what is actually happening, like how we're applying these principles and these tactics in a real life situation with a real story. So that's the conference. If you want to learn more about how to engage someone's story well, please consider signing up for the virtual Zoom conference. It'll be Saturday, May 13th from 8 to 4 Pacific. It's $129, and you can sign up on my website, adamyoungcounseling.com. And we hope that you will join us on Saturday, May 13th. Cathy, thank you for coming on the podcast yet again.
Thanks, Adam. Looking forward to the conference.